once again, I share Ms. Michaud's concerns that are well explained, and I've called on our Deputy Associate Minister about information on details. I've had informal discussions with colleagues regarding that advisory committee, and it is our intention to respect commitments we've made. We've had numerous meetings on regulations. So it is a pity that these two questions fall one after the other, because the answer is similar. We're close. We're almost there. I hope to get good news very soon. And I share your Ms. Michaud's sense of urgency. And we're not going to wait for a potential successor, to take on my position before we get this done. Thank you. That's reassuring. And now regarding the border agencies and ArriveCAN. Some have proposed putting the agency under trusteeship. I wonder what you think. Is CBSA at fault here, or is it your government's bad habit of contracting everything out? Listen, the circumstances around ArriveCAN are worrisome, and here again, I share the concerns of my colleagues and that of Canadians about how public funds are being used. There's investigations underway. Our CMP is involved to some extent, and I have much confidence in Ms. Gorman, who couldn't be here, but Ms. O'Gorman, in charge of CBSA, had already put in place some remedies in place to change the way this program could be managed. And so to reduce this contracting out. So measures that are put in place, I believe, will do away with instances where money has been badly managed by certain individuals. And they're my colleagues at Treasury Board and Procurement who are looking into this. This has to be done government-wide. It's not just CBSA that needs to be targeted in terms of strengthening transparency. We are hard at work, once again, to effect these changes. And we're always open to other changes when investigations are completed and we have recommendations, including from the Auditor General. Mr. Julian. Thank you very much, Chair. Thanks to our witnesses. Thanks to our Minister. Very quick in answer to Ms. Michaud, you said very soon for the buyback program and the advisory committee. So what are the timelines? Does this mean in the next 2 weeks, 4 weeks? What exactly are you talking about when you say very soon? Very good question. And again, I had informal discussions with Mr. Julian on many an occasion on this buyback program. I believe we share the objectives. I apologize for interrupting. I would like to understand the timelines. Good question. The list of ministers and deputy ministers who have made commitments on an exact timelines is long. We talked about a week or two. What does very soon mean? Is it, 4, 5 weeks? I'm not going to venture into saying 2 weeks or 3 weeks, because then if it turns out to be 4 weeks, you'll say I am off by a week. So I share your concerns, and I can reassure you, Mr. Julian, that when I know I can appear here once again, then will you be able then to talk about the details? And we can certainly discuss our schedules and make that is a commitment on my part. It's my pleasure.
Comments, but the Auditor General's report this week has been incredibly critical, particularly about the First Nations and Inuit policing program. And Cindy Woodhouse of the FN said all the evidence talking about the inquiry around the James Smith Cree Nation if a First Nations police service had been equitably funded in the James Smith Cree Nation, the tragedy could have been avoided. You have the Auditor General's report talking about the fact that there is no clear governance around the funding is not clearly tracked, and there are dozens of First Nations communities that don't have access to policing. Well, how many communities have been refused to have in place the basic police services, and what is your ministry going to do to fix what is a tragedy?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question, and I certainly share the concerns expressed by the Auditor General and by Mr. Julian. I had an opportunity to speak with her for probably an hour to understand from her personally the work she had done, the nature of her recommendations. I appreciate that. And we've committed, obviously, to improving some of the, correcting some of the challenges that she properly identified. I look forward to working with Indigenous partners on legislation around designating an essential service and the long-term reliable funding. That's also a challenge, but recognizing her concerns around the proper management of that funding is something that we also will do. One of the challenges, and I'm learning about this long-standing frustration that Indigenous communities and provincial governments have had, is that we are necessarily in a space where we have to work with provinces and territories. I was surprised at my first meeting that provincial ministers, territorial ministers, understandably very jealously guard their jurisdiction in the administration of justice. So it makes it complicated, but it shouldn't be a barrier to achieving the results, the improvements that we want. But it does necessarily involve arriving at agreements with different provincial governments and Indigenous communities. But I certainly take the concern that Mr. Julian expressed, and he mentioned the James Smith Cree Nation. And again, that was a tragic circumstance, and we think about the horrible violence inflicted on that community. And I know my colleagues, perhaps in the second hour from the Correctional Service and the Parole Board, met with the community a couple of weeks ago and can speak to those specific items. I just didn't want to miss the fact that you raised that tragedy. I
have two follow-up questions. First off, the Auditor General indicates that there's $45 million that will be left unspent, unallocated at the same time as communities need those resources by the end of this fiscal year. What steps are you taking to make sure that that $45 million is put out? Secondly, one of the things that has been indicated by the Auditor General and Indigenous organizations as well is that there is no culturally appropriate or culturally specific training for officers in those communities. Now, we're talking about Indigenous communities that have often a profound distrust of policing, given our police role in dragging off Indigenous kids to residential schools in those horrific conditions. What are the steps that you are going to take to ensure that there is culturally appropriate, culturally specific training for those officers? And how do you ensure that $45 million is spent?
Mr. Chair, two very important questions from Mr. Julian. I have confidence the RCMP have understood and share exactly that concern around the appropriate cultural sensitivity training and understanding of that history that Mr. Julian referred to. My conversations with the Commissioner, and he can elaborate perhaps also at a different moment on the work they've done and the funding, the investments that we have made in partnership with the management of the RCMP to correct this very understandable concern that Mr. Julian raised. It is improving. There is still more work to do, and the leadership of the RCMP is committed to doing that work. With respect to the lapsed money, I was very surprised in my conversation with the Auditor General when I was briefed on her report. There is such a need to invest in this space, including with provinces and territories, as I said, but it doesn't absolve the Government of Canada of its responsibility to do the right thing. The idea that this money would lapse or not be allocated is understandably something that was surprising and concerning to me. Our Associate Deputy Minister has assured me that those circumstances won't repeat themselves in terms of arriving at agreements with provinces and territories. Again, it sounds like I'm sort of avoiding the question by talking about provinces and territories, but the constitutional requirement to deliver these services under provincial legislation means that simply allocating money that's outside of an agreement with a province and territory doesn't work. And Some provinces are better at this than others. Some respond more quickly. Some have capacity challenges. Doesn't absolve us of the responsibility to do more and not see that funding lapse.
Thank you.
Totally share that view.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Mr. Julian. We're moving into the second round now. Mr. Caputo for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and I will address all of my questions directly to the witnesses through you. Thank you to all the witnesses. Thank you, Minister, for being here. Commissioner Kelly, can you please confirm that disgraced former Colonel Russell Williams is also at La Casa, which houses Paul Bernardo and Luca Magnotta?
No, I cannot confirm. I cannot confirm that information.
Now, how about Guy Turcotte? Is he also there?
I can also not confirm that information.
Did you confirm that Luca Magnotta was there? Did the CSC eventually confirm that?
Well, that's in the public domain right now.
And how about Paul Bernardo? Did the CSC eventually confirm that they were there?
That's also was in the public domain.
I'm not asking whether it was in the public domain. I'm asking whether the CSC confirmed it for those two offenders, but you're not prepared to confirm it for the other two. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay, so we have one set of rules and another set of rules. I'm clear there. Now, Minister, the regulations, as you know, we have the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, and the Corrections and Conditional Release Act talks about the regulations. We're clear, obviously, on that. Now, when it comes to the regulations, the government, the minister, you have control over those regulations, correct?
No, there's a process through Treasury Board and a regulatory process, but I recognize that it's in the hands of the Cabinet, yes.
It is in the hands. So the final say over the regulations is with the government. We can be clear on that, correct?
Again, I'm not an expert on parliamentary procedure. I think there's a committee, a joint scrutiny of regulations committee. Our colleagues in the Senate are very interested in these issues. I think
Minister, let's not get into...
But if you want to have an esoteric discussion on the regulatory process, I'd be happy to have.
I'm not having an esoteric discussion. I'm saying when it comes to the regulations, the buck stops with the government, correct?
Again, there's a parliamentary review process that I'm not familiar with. So I get the trap in the question. I'll say yes, and then you'll find an example. So I recognize that regulations are in the hands of the Cabinet.
It's no trap. It's actually very clear. The reality is that the government creates the regulations. Then the CSC, Correctional Service of Canada, implements those regulations. Okay? Those regulations allowed for the transfer of Bernardo and Magnotta. Okay? So you have the ability to change those regulations, correct?
The government has a general authority as long as it's within the four corners of the statute to change regulations.
I'm not talking about the authority. In this case, Minister, the government could change the regulations and it hasn't, correct?
Our government has confidence that the regulations are appropriate in giving the correctional service, in their independent and professional judgment, the responsibility of assigning convicted federal offenders, in this case, people convicted of murder, to the appropriate, secure federal penitentiary.
So in this case, you are okay with the likes of Magnotta, Bernardo, and Williams being not only in medium security, but being together at La Casa, correct?
Well, again, for operational security reasons that the Commissioner can elaborate, we don't discuss or actually do videos telling Canadians where particular inmates are serving their sentences. It's for the security of the men and women who work in those institutions. So that's an irresponsible course that I don't think we're going to start on. And I share the concern that Canadians have about...
Minister, we're not talking about my conduct. We're talking here about the government and whether you will create regulations. Because those regulations allowed the transfer of Bernardo, they allowed the transfer of Williams, and they allowed the transfer of Magnotta. And you're here telling us, no, CSC is going to do their job. Minister, you have the opportunity to change those regulations right here, right now. Will you commit to do this? Because you've said we don't intervene on specific cases. I'm not asking for you to intervene on a specific case, Minister. I'm asking for you to intervene on a class of offenders. Will you intervene on a class of offenders, an injustice that has happened, and change those regulations right here, right now?
Well, again, if you want to be technical, I actually can't change those regulations right here and right now. I explained to you there's a Treasury Board process
will you
with
commit
the governor,
right here, right now,
with the governor and council. So no, I can't change those regulations right here and right now, Mr. Chair.
Will you commit to changing those regulations to address this class of offender, yes or no?
I will commit to ensure that those regulations which focus as their most important objective